we are. All right. Thank you, folks, for joining us. I won't necessarily say it's our pleasure to offer this because obviously the circumstances may not warrant it, but we are in some sense pleased to be able to offer a talk by our new political science faculty members, Dr. Dan Mintun, who recently finished his PhD from the University of North Texas and has joined us primarily in the areas of international relations and conflict management. So in that regard, considering Russia's recent invasion of the Ukraine, we asked Dan if he would mind giving us a primer on the conflict. And so, yeah, we're looking for kind of an overview and then some time for questions and answers. So if you have some questions, make sure to save them and then put them in the chat if you don't want to forget them. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Dr. Mintun. Thank you.
Well, I guess allowing me to talk on this. Again, wish this was under happier circumstances. I can kind of introduce myself to the faculty here, but I'm happy that I can at least be of help. I'm trying to make sense of all this because this is something that not only caught the world off guard, but also experts. People were kind of thinking that there would not be a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but now this is kind of made us rethink a lot of things that we've been studying for the past 20, 30 years since really the post-Cold War period. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of background on what has actually been happening mostly over the past decade or so. Because to go over the entire history of Ukraine and Russian relations would take an entire semester at least. So so yeah, we'll go ahead and if you can click on the PowerPoint.
Oh yeah, sorry, try that. There.
Yeah. So just to kind of begin with, Ukraine is a former Soviet state, and it was actually one of the more prominent Soviet states. So it was really Russia, and Ukraine was kind of number two. And it actually had our third largest nuclear arsenal following the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that's actually relevant today, considering that there's actually been some hinting at using tactical nuclear weapons by the Putin administration. So this is something that is kind of an issue, to say the least, because one of the things Ukraine agreed back in 1994 was that if we turn over our nuclear weapons, there will be protections from both the West and the East, meaning protections from Russia and also protections from the Western world. So this is very relevant today because we do not see nuclear powers actually attack each other. But Ukraine is no longer a nuclear power. So this is of concern, especially for them. We're going to fast forward a little bit to the 2013, 2014 revolution, where this is where you start seeing a lot of anti-Russian movements in Ukraine. The president, he fled in 2014 revolutions that were violent revolutions in his youth. And you actually start seeing, a very anti-Russian sentiment, and the population gravitating more towards a Western policy. So in 2014, you start seeing them actually, electing pro-Western parties in their government. So, and in response to all this, you actually see Russia actually annex Crimea, where originally they said, oh no, those aren't Russian troops. And then eventually they said, oh yeah, those are Russian troops. And the rest of the world went, yeah, we knew. Didn't really fool anybody. So that's really one of the points of contention right now, is that pretty much any peace offering that these two sides would have would probably include Ukraine recognizing the annexation of Crimea. So basically giving up that as a bartering chip. So again, another point of contention right now. So
Still not.
yeah, it's whenever you get quick on the.
I'm trying. There we go.
Yeah. So anyway, so Russia, we're going to kind of fast forward again to February, or just a month ago, where you actually start seeing Russian troops lining up against the Ukraine border. So you saw about 100,000 troops originally, and this kind of slowly amassed to what we assume is close to 200,000 troops. This is not the first time Russia has done this since 2014. They've actually been doing a lot of military exercises for the past 8 years along there. So we as political scientists didn't really think too much of it other than, okay, well, he's trying to play strongman, trying to do some political kind of maneuvering. show that strength, because the Russian economy was not doing great prior to the invasion. After the invasion, things got much, much worse for them, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So you see this huge massing of troops, and on February 21st is actually when you start seeing the first signs that there's going to be a full-scale invasion. So they originally said, or Putin declared the Donetsk and the Luhansk regions to actually be independent areas or independent territories. And they actually started mobilizing troops into these eastern regions over here under the guise that they were actually going in as peacekeepers to really help liberate the people and prevent Ukrainian tyranny for the Russians that lived there. So on February 24th is actually when you see the full-scale invasion. You start seeing troops actually come in from the northern area of Belarus and also coming in from the south too. And you end up with what we have today, where this is what the current map looks like as of this morning. So you have a lot of focus right now on Kyiv, which is also Kiev. Kiev is the more Russian pronunciation or spelling, but Ukrainians tend to go by Kyiv, which is more historically Ukrainian. So you ever see those two, they're kind of interchangeable. I know there's been some confusion on that. So you're starting to see a lot of talk about Kyiv because that's where the president is for Ukraine right now, and a lot of political leaders. So if Kyiv falls, that would likely be the fall of the Ukrainian government. And we'll talk a little bit about why that would actually be potentially an issue. Or there's kind of from a political science standpoint, you want them to probably, well, I know a lot of people are saying they should really have some governance in Lviv right now, because if there is a fall of Kyiv, at least you would have a kind of government to actually go against the new Russian kind of rulers over there, for lack of a better word. So, but at the same time, no government officials fleeing is not going to be good for morale. So they're kind of caught in a rough space right now. So, but a lot of the news the past couple days have been Kharkiv, and I'm actually going to butcher that name, Mariupol.
Yeah, Mariupol.
Yeah. So yeah, this has been in the news because Russians were accused of bombing or firing missiles at a maternity ward, a hospital, and killing several civilians. And Kharkiv has been really witnessing severe bombing and shelling since the start of the invasion. So they're kind of one of the last holdouts for making sure Kyiv doesn't get encircled, because Russian tactics historically have been surround the city and siege. And yeah, Russian tactics leave much to be desired for the modern world. As far as from a military strategist standpoint, they tend to just throw in as many troops and tanks as possible, but they're not really maneuverable. So kind of very old school World War II tactics is what we're seeing still today. So and as far as the big convoys, there have been 30-40 mile convoys moving towards Kyiv, and a lot of them have stalled due to a lack of resources, it sounds like. But again, a lot of these are reports that we can't really substantiate, because a lot of information has been controlled by both the Ukrainian government and the Russian government. So a lot of what we're looking at are from satellite images and what we can hear from the governments, but obviously those are going to be skewed due to the fact that they want to kind of control information that's coming in. So right now, negotiations have really fully stalled between the two sides. They've been mostly trying to negotiate for safe passage for civilians to get out. Now, this has been a point of contention because Russians say absolutely they can. We'll actually put together these safe tunnels or these routes as long as they go towards Belarus and Russia. That is not going to be a big thing for Ukrainians. They don't want to retreat to Russia because that's kind of why this whole war is happening in the first place. They don't want to be Russian. So they've actually kind of fallen apart every time they bring it up. They've actually agreed to several ceasefires, and almost every time they've been broken by the Russian side. Russian outlets have been saying, oh, it's Ukrainians actually bombing themselves. They're using civilians as bodies, like human shields, essentially. So there's a lot of propaganda, a lot of misinformation kind of coming out of this, which is something that's been really concerning, I guess, from a political science standpoint is the information that is coming in and out of here. So yeah, but right now, Russia's advance towards Kyiv is probably the big thing to focus on. If they are able to take that, then you might see a very different story as far as how these negotiations may go. So as far as some of the international impact that we're seeing here, we've seen over 2 million refugees fleeing Ukraine. There are obviously a lot more internally displaced, including a lot of people fleeing to Lviv and other places that are not being shelled currently. But 2 million people have fled, and this is going to have a huge impact on the surrounding region. A lot of those are actually NATO members, so that's actually a big part of this too. And in addition, this is going to have a severe economic impact on the rest of Europe, because a lot of people kind of worry about the humanitarian part, which they should. As someone that does have concerns with that myself, but refugees are expensive. They're also incredibly destabilizing. So this is really an international concern, not just Russia and Ukraine. So this does span kind of everywhere. As far as the other kind of things to know, I'm sure everybody's kind of been aware of the sanctions on Russia and some of the impacts it's had on your wallet. Looking at the increase in gas prices and whatnot, while we did not import a ton from Russia, it has put a huge demand on other sources of oil across the world, which has kind of had a direct impact on global economies. So we've had a pretty unified effort to try to sanction Russia and try to put economic pressures on them. Now, a lot of people kind of criticize sanctions such as these because it kind of creates a humanitarian crisis in Russia as well for the civilians that are not fighting the war. But the whole point of sanctions really is to put pressure on civilians, to put pressure on their government is the whole. And you're starting to see more targeted sanctions towards the oligarchs, the extremely wealthy, the people that are part of Putin's inner circle. So that way, if those people start turning on Putin, you might actually see concessions from the Russian government. So you're starting to see this, especially with the UK. They're putting a lot of sanctions specifically on the Russian oligarchs that own football teams over there, such as, was it Chelsea? Yeah, the owner of Chelsea sold the team and has been sanctioned heavily. This is also important too because I know a lot of people have talked about the crashing of Russian currency, the ruble. So one of the things that Russia tried to do to stabilize its economy in the past is they would put money in offshore accounts. Basically holding out the ruble by having a lot of other currencies around the world. Now that only works when you actually have access to that money. And they no longer really have access to that money due to the sanctions. So while a lot of people were saying maybe we're not doing enough, we have actually, as far as the Western world, I should say not the United States specifically, but a lot of these countries have actually hit them where it hurts the most, even though it may not seem like it on paper. Right. So, and the big note from this is that the EU and NATO have really had a unified response. So you've actually started to see a strengthening of these kind of old alliances, which Putin really kind of was expecting, NATO to fall apart or to kind of falter. So he kind of gambled wrong with that. So that's been a big miscalculation on his part.
Sorry.
Oh yeah.
I'll keep running it.
And we'll kind of wrap it up here as far as my portion of just kind of giving you a background. But some of the things that, as political scientists, we've been kind of looking at are the Russia domestic situation. So kind of looking at, well, right now there's a lot more disapproval of Putin, both from the masses, but also more importantly, his inner circle. You're also starting to see politicians publicly speak out, which is pretty amazing because usually if Putin, you don't live very long after that. Lots of assassination kind of things, mysterious poisonings, maybe not so mysterious, but there's a lot of opposition to Putin. So these are usually situations where you do see potentials for government change or some actual domestic government structure changes. As far as global economics, I know a lot of you have kind of seen this, as I already said, some of the impacts. But it's also going to have a ripple effect where the United States right now is in talks with Venezuela about maybe opening up trade for Venezuelan oil again, which we've actually not had any trade with Venezuela since 2019 due to their fabricated results of their election, where we have not recognized the president, or Nicolas Maduro, over there since 2019. So this war with Ukraine may actually kind of force the United States hand into actually recognizing Nicolas Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela if we want to help offset the costs. Because one of the reasons why we actually didn't have oil coming in from Russia is because we cut off trade with Venezuela. So we used Russian oil to help offset that cost 3 years ago. Yeah, internet disinformation, propaganda, these are things just kind of looking at how the nature of warfare has changed. This has been a very popular topic amongst political scientists over the past few years. And lastly, this is the one that kind of comes up the most often, is the nuclear question, right? A lot of people are concerned about, well, Russia and this crazy guy Putin, is he actually going to use, and I'm using air quotes because we don't like to use that word crazy in political science either. It's just they're rational, but we don't know what their game is. Basically our way of saying that they're crazy in air quotes. But yeah, so that's been the big thing is, are they actually willing to use a nuclear weapon, especially because traditional tactics have not been successful so far? And what would that mean as far as, kind of the reemergence of the Cold War? That's really been the million-dollar question. So, that being said, that's kind of the background I had for you today. Now I want to really open it up because people have very different questions, very different perspectives on this. Some people want to focus on the humanitarian stuff. Some people like to talk about the war game strategy stuff, and I'm more than happy to talk about any of those. But I wanted to make this as useful or enlightening as possible to my audience. So I figured I would kind of open it up.
Okay, do you mind if I stop sharing this?
Yeah, absolutely. Cool.
All right, and then we have a couple of ones in chat so far. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Doug. All right. I would read that.
You can close the participants window.
I'll let you read it.
The first line.
This is from Dr. Julian, one of our English colleagues. I would like to go back to the choice of denuclearization of Ukraine in 1994 that is often used as a basis for greater world involvement in the conflict. My memory and limited research would say that there really wasn't a deterrent because though ICBMs made to hit the US could hit only very distant locations in Russia and cruise missiles were disabled pre or during the dissolution of the CIS. A, is that true? B, did the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, that was a bit of a no-brainer because A was true and thus lead us to this moment where Ukraine was more closely aligned with the West. C, so in what ways does it make sense to say they had a nuclear deterrent? Dr. Mintun.
All right, so I'm trying to figure out where to start with tackling that.
We're out of time. Thank you all for coming out.
Great.
Thank you.
Great, if you close the participants window, we can see the full
Oh,
chat.
yeah.
Okay. I like the idea that you could only see snippets. Fine. There we go.
All right, so as far as the non-proliferation treaty, this is actually something that, well, Craig asked me a question earlier of, well, what does this actually mean for security purposes? And would the world actually respond with using nuclear weapons if Russia does decide to use it? Now that's a really complicated question because, again, part of the reason why you wouldn't necessarily expect it is because, well, Ukraine doesn't have these nuclear weapons. That would have been the deterrent. But yeah, it's one of those situations that if Ukraine did have a nuclear arsenal, Russia does not make the attack. They may have annexed Crimea in 2014, but they would not dare to go after this because you have something called mutually assured destruction. Where, yeah, if you fire one missile, we'll fire back tenfold. As far as the actual question here.
Right. Is it true that they had a nuclear deterrent because of the nature of the nuclear arsenal?
Yeah. Well, right now it would have been Ukraine's hope would have been, okay, well, our allies, the people in the West, do have nuclear deterrent themselves. But now what you're seeing is that, well, that's not really a deterrent. So what I think what you'll see is if, well, Russia does in fact use a nuke or like a tactical nuke, or something like that, which is, they try to dress it up and say it's gonna be small scale, nuclear weapon, which is worse than the bombs that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But, what you're gonna see is global nuclear proliferation, where it's really sending a signal to these mid powers that it doesn't matter who you're allied with, you need those weapons yourself. That could be the potential takeaway, unless you are a part of NATO. And a lot of places are going to be hesitant, or a lot of these alliances are going to be hesitant to accept new members because of the costs. Because no country, like, as much as it sounds tragic to say, as far as a strategic standpoint or defense standpoint, Ukraine is in some ways, as far as US foreign policy, as much as it would be a humanitarian disaster, it's something that you can't really see as no, it's not going to destroy the United States. So it's bigger risk than cost. And these are really difficult conversations to have because this is something that you saw in the 60s, 70s. A lot of these same questions are being raised again. So, and it's just kind of interesting in an era that we like to think about humanitarian aid and those kind of things. So we're gonna have to start really questioning what's actually a viable strategy to help out some of these threats.
Okay, one more question from the chat, and obviously if we have questions in the audience, we'll get to them as well. Matt asks 3 related questions, so we'll kind of take them in turn, I suppose. Do you see a wedge opening up between Putin and the oligarchs? Do you see members of the Russian military meaningfully revolting against orders that they are receiving, like they did in World War I? And where do other pillars of support for the Russian state, like the Orthodox Church, where do they stand? And will it impel them to revolt against Putin?
Right, so to answer that first one, yes, there's absolutely been a wedge between Putin and the oligarchs and even the opposition parties. So we're actually seeing in the Duma in Russia that there are actually people that actually condemn the invasion of Ukraine, which they're not allowed to use that word. Right now in Russia, you're not allowed to use the words war, invasion, or attack, because they're seeing this as a peace operation. That's how they're spitting into their domestic population. So, but you actually have seen oligarchs actually condemn the actions of Putin, which is something that you haven't seen in the past. So yes, that's usually a situation where I was talking to
Somebody's.
Dean's office, this is Betty.
Hey,
Hey, fine, how are you?
probably. There you are. We all got.
Okay,
That's how many answers.
Right, so
There we go. All right, continue.
all right, so do you see members of the Russian military being Putin? At this point, no, I don't see that, at least in the short term. The long term, as more supply chain issues increase, you may see more revolting or kind of en masse. But right now, the kind of desertion and stuff like that has been pretty minimal. They've been, from what we can tell from the Ukrainian standpoint, they've been kind of really publicizing when Russian soldiers are turning themselves over. But that seems to be pretty exaggerated right now. If anything, you're seeing an escalation. And right now, Russian troops are very willing to target civilians and civilian populations. So at the moment, I'm not seeing a full revolt because while the Ukrainians have put up an intense fight, they're really no match for the Russians as far as the traditional war. What you'll probably see is more of urban combat, which usually requires a lot more troops, a lot more resources. Estimates usually 5 times as many troops to actually take over the same amount of territory if you're in an urban situation. So you're about to see this turn into a war in the streets where you have to clear out building by building and keep that clear, which is going to be incredibly expensive, incredibly taxing on the Russian military. So once it gets to that point, maybe you start seeing more people leaving the Russian military or having more grievances there. And what was the last
The last one
question?
was about the church. I know the Oh.
Yeah, so the Russian Orthodox Church, it's actually been interesting. Their Pope has actually said that this is a very good thing. Like he's actually been very pro invasion. Again, not allowed to use that word, but he's saying that this is actually the act of God. Like this is something that having the separation from the church could have been influential, at least for the general public. But right now, the church seems to be pretty on board from what I've been able to see. But again, it's hard to know what's actually going on because everything that's been coming out of Russia has been pre-recorded, and it's really hard to know what is actually happening behind the scenes. So, but yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Let's open it up to questions in the room. I don't want to ignore our in-person audience, and then we'll come back and answer the other questions that are in the chat. Yeah,
so we've seen kind of a very almost like restrained response from Russia as far as they're only using 20,000 troops, and that's been causing a lot of issues because Ukraine's mobilized so many more forces, and Ukraine has already drug this out longer than most experts expected. So kind of two questions. How long do you think they could hold out if Russia keeps up this kind of whether because of logistics or because they don't want to further alienate the international community? How long can Ukraine hold out? Probably from this, we're still getting reinforced a lot of stuff from the US. And is it likely that Russia could start mobilizing the rest of their forces? And if so, how long would that take them?
Right, so as far as to answer the first question on how long can the Ukrainians hold out, right now while the noose is closing, they have actually been still fighting pretty well. You have seen Russia actually increase their willingness to actually engage in just civilian warfare, where they are using civilian targets. And you can see this by the types of weapons they're using. They're using less and less accurate missile systems. So they're using vacuum bombs, which again, you're using weapons that you cannot even realistically say, no, we're only targeting military sites, because these things are by their nature incredibly inaccurate and devastating to the surrounding environment. So you're seeing an escalation. As far as how much they're willing to continue escalating as far as mobilizing the rest of the army, I don't think they can realistically do that and also keep up their rhetoric at home, because Russia has two problems. They have the Ukraine problem, but they also have a domestic problem. So the domestic problem is they're not at war. They're telling the public they're not at war. So in order to actually mobilize the rest of the army, you have to acknowledge we're at war, and all of a sudden you have to start opening up the information of what did the Russians actually do. And that's really not a great way to do this, because the whole guise was we're liberating the Russians in Ukraine. They were killing our brethren over there. They're killing our ethnic kin. And you can't really say that when you're bombing entire cities that you're supposedly protecting. So I don't think they can realistically mobilize the rest of the army to keep that domestic situation under control. So it's a balancing act, which is very delicate on their part. So,
other questions in the room? No.
Yeah, how is humanitarian aid getting into the Ukraine now?
Good question. Not legally. Yeah, because a lot of this humanitarian aid has been mostly coming in through the West, as far as we know, on the ground, because we're not willing to fly anything into Ukraine because potential for actual interaction between the Russian Air Force and all that stuff. So it's been coming in slowly through the West, and mostly kind of getting into Lviv, and they're trying to get it to other places, but it's been a bit of a struggle because they don't really have their superiority. So getting large chunks of supplies to Kyiv or these places that are under siege has proven to be a big challenge. But yeah, there has been some military aid and things that are, it seems like it's waiting on the borders, if they can figure out how to get it in, and also trying to figure out how Russia is going to take that. Is that actually an act of war? They haven't said anything specifically about small arms being transported in, but obviously they've stopped big weapon systems from getting in, such as tanks and more specifically the MiG-29s. So, yeah. So right now, Russia is going to have air superiority probably in the short, or pretty soon, which is going to be making it that much more difficult for the Ukrainians to hold out.
There's a question from Chloe, who I think is on her way to Shreveport right now, so hence, please ignore typos. Essentially, her question is, do you think the Europeans are going to come together in their leaders and have a stronger plan to kind of separate themselves from Russian goods and, energy dependence? And do you think Biden would then follow suit in the United States?
To answer that first part, yes, we've already seen a lot of these leaders actually take pretty strong stances as far as trying to go more renewable sources, get away from Russian oil, because that's the one commodity that Russia has that could potentially get them out of this economic crisis that they're in, is dependency on Russian oil. So you're starting to see Germany specifically, well, they're trying to go renewable, and also they are starting to build the military again, which is something that we didn't think we would see in this day and age, like Germany actually mobilizing in the rest of Europe, actually saying, yeah, that's a good idea. So that's, again, 2020 is a strange year. So, yeah, as far as Biden following suit, I think as far as our connections to Russia, we didn't have many connections to Russia to begin with as far as economics. Again, we had a little bit of no trade with oil, but we were not big trade partners. So that's part of the problem when we're trying to target sanctions. It really wasn't going to impact them directly unless the rest of the world kind of combined. So it was really symbolic that the United States did it in more ways than not. But yeah, you could potentially see Biden really trying to help the European powers find creative solutions to this energy crisis. So really trying to work with members of OPEC, those kind of things to help alleviate these issues. So, yeah.
Yes, I was wondering if you have any updates about the appeal for international volunteers?
Oh, I actually do not right now. I do know that some of the first kind of international volunteers have actually started making their way to the front lines. But yeah, I really have not looked too much into that, other than Zelensky is willing to take anybody that's willing to carry a rifle or be anywhere near conflict. Because I know they did waive the need for visas to actually enter Ukraine, and saying if you're willing to fight on our side, we'll take you. Which is actually interesting. I know I did a little bit of research for the first time on what's the actual legality of fighting for another country. And actually, yeah, there's nothing as far, I'm not advocating for this by any means. That's all your individual decisions, but it's actually not illegal for a United States citizen to actually pick up arms for another country. We actually saw this a lot in World War I and World War II prior to us actually declaring war. So, and there's been nothing on the books that prevents you from doing it.
Yeah, I heard something on the BBC where they interviewed a couple of British, I guess, members of the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, we would call them now. So, all right, any other questions in the room before we? Dr.
I'm just kind of curious, assuming that Russia completes the takeover of Ukraine, I'm curious what you think the after effects are going to be in terms of international relations.
Yeah, I have that question.
So yeah, it's kind of interesting because well, that's kind of a twofold question in some ways, because what the original end game was that we'll have a quick, not full takeover of Ukraine. We're going to overthrow the government, take over some big cities, and we'll put in a puppet government like we have in Belarus. That's almost what we can not guarantee, but that seemed to be what was going to happen. Unfortunately, they got bogged down and we're not able to take it over in 72 hours. Like the actual original plans that leaked, they said that they're going to be out of there in 15 days. They were wrong because this is the 15th day. But yeah, so you have that problem. But as far as if they do actually control or completely take over Ukraine, I don't think they're going to go far west of Kyiv. So I don't know what they're going to do with Western Ukraine. I don't think they're going to continue going over there because the logistics of that, Ukraine's a big place. So, and they've already had problems getting, things 30 miles as far as the convoys and things. So I think really what you're going to see is a puppet government of Ukraine, and probably some kind of liberty fighters or something like that, some kind of counterinsurgency stuff. are insurgent attacks in the cities. But yeah, it's gonna be a really long, complicated conflict even after the war, so it's gonna be no battle-ridden place.
I had one follow-on to that, then we'll get to one of Dr. Julian's questions. My question on that is, do you think let's say they do, let's say they take over Kyiv and they put in their public government, and there's kind of a rump state out based in Lviv and so forth. Does the world eventually relent on the economic sanctions? Like, do they let them have SWIFT back? You know, do they let the banking go back, or do we just keep them at it?
That's actually an interesting question that it's hard to know.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
again, you're kind of thinking about, well, you're dealing with a bunch of different democracies. So democracies by their nature, they have regime change. They have different presidents coming. They have people that are willing to lift sanctions or ones that are looking for, hey, we're going into an election year, our economy is really bad, we could actually use some reprieve here. So there's a two-level game here of domestic politics for each member that's dealing with the sanctions, as well as the international consequences. So I think it's unfortunately a domestic pressure for people are more concerned about their wallets over global security. You might actually see loosening of that, not soon, but in a few years potentially.
Yeah.
I can see that absolutely happening in an election year, but that's a pessimist thing.
It's the political scientist.
Yeah.
All right, one question from Dr. Julian that he says can go unanswered, but I don't. He says in 2011, social media had a significant role in the Egyptian revolution, uprising, essentially the removal of Mubarak. Do you see any sense of this in Russia? And do you, as a political scientist, do you see the role of social media in any regime change?
So Russia learned the lesson that a lot of other dictatorships really learned after 2011: do not have free and open media. Because Mubarak did the absolute worst thing you could do in 2011, where they had free and open internet. You started seeing the emergence of things like Facebook and Twitter to actually, people were organizing revolutions through these things. And what they did is they shut everything down and said, no, you're not allowed to communicate, which just kind of fueled the fire at that time. We're actually starting to see things like that in Russia, but Russia has something that a lot of these other places don't. They have a really, really good team of misinformation kind of propaganda people, which we saw meddling in the 2016 election by these same groups. So they're not dumb. And they also have complete control of the media. So there's not a free and open press in Russia. So where most people actually get their news is not through the internet in Russia, it's through TV. And all the TV stations are owned by the Russian government. So that's why they're able to control what you're actually able to communicate. They're allowed to say you're not allowed to use these words. They have actually finally acknowledged that there are casualties in Ukraine just a few days ago, because they said it was a peacekeeping operation. They're like, 600 people have died over there, Russian troops. Reality, we're estimating from the United States is close to 5,000 or 6,000. But it's, again, difficult to know. But they have a much tighter control over the media in Russia. So as far as the role that plays, it remains to be determined, I guess. But right now, the internet companies or providers are actually pulling out of Russia. So you're starting to see maybe more dependence on the state-run media. So I mean, again, it's whether or not people are willing to agree with that, if they buy into that rhetoric. There are a lot of people that still deny that they're at war or there are any troops in Ukraine. There are people in the United States right now that still deny that this war even exists or it's occurring. So thanks in part to the Russian propaganda.
That's hardly remarkable, considering the proportion of Americans who still believe the last election was stolen.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of what that proportion is? My guess is 1 out of 6, but I don't want to be overly optimistic or pessimistic. Your field would know that better than I do.
It's difficult to know because a lot of this is kind of fueled by the this is one thing that people seem to be familiar with the movement, even if they don't know the name, but the QAnon movement, which is kind of the alt-right movement. And this is really where a lot of the propaganda is coming from.
Sure.
Is everything's been rigged, and a lot of this is actually been traced back again to Russia. So a lot of what they're doing is using old footage from movies and saying, see, these people have makeup on, they're crisis actors, they're doing it. So I don't think 1 in 6, as far as the United States, that might be a little high.
No, I wasn't thinking of Q in particular.
Yeah.
I was thinking like Americans who believe the last election was rigged. And it was stolen and it was delivered to the wrong president. There was a conspiracy and the last election was stolen and we've
Yeah.
got to,
So.
we have the right to do what we need to do in the legislature to get it back. And that faction.
Yeah, so I think there are two different parts of that, where, you have the people that think it was rigged and all that stuff, or that maybe there is some tampering.
Right.
And then there's a smaller subsect of that that says all means necessary, which is what we saw on January sixth.
Right.
Those are the people that are more willing to actually take action against the government directly. I don't know what, I think the population, when you're saying is maybe there's some meddling, maybe that 1 in 6 number is, pretty close to accurate, it's hard to know. But as far as people that are willing to take up arms against the government, that's a much smaller number right now. But again, it's really hard to know, because those people don't usually, openly publicize that they're going to take on the government, because that's an act of, that's a crime.
Surprising number two.
As someone that, very briefly in it.
I think there's a class that wants to come in here at once, so I think we probably do it. We do have to cut it short, or on time. Would you be adverse to folks reaching out to you if they have questions? Okay. If you want to reach out to Dr. Mintun, this is his email. So it's D Mintun. You can email him your questions. This is a conversation that we could have for hours. Certainly.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the restrictions of education, we need to leave the classroom. So that being said, let's go ahead and say thank you. Thank you very much.